Okay, picking up, this is part 3, longer article. Okay, so we're starting here on page 6 of 14 with the section called Pathways. It says research supports biological and behavioral health pathways that explain observed associations between social connection and health outcome. So, the question here is, what is the relationship between isolation and health. Social connectedness is how connected you are to other people. Are you isolated or are you very socially active? Okay. Behavioral pathways include better sleep, greater physical activity, increased likelihood of medical screenings, and improved medical adherence or sticking to what's medically advised. There is also growing evidence, including several reviews supporting biological mechanisms such as cardiovascular, endocrine, that's your thyroid and glands and things, and immune markers. For example, longitudinal data from 4 nationally representative samples demonstrate that social connection has a dose-response effect on C-reactive protein, systolic and diastolic blood pressure, waist circumference, how big around your waist is, and body mass index within each life stage. Indicators of social connections have been associated with lower risk for psychological dysregulation and lower levels of inflammation, whereas social isolation and loneliness are associated with elevations in some markers of systemic inflammation. Now, there's a lot there that we don't understand, and there's a lot there that we don't need to understand, okay? What we conclude, the answer to our question, what's the relationship between isolation and help, is that the correlation is the more socially connected, the better it is for your health and well-being. Okay. Now here's a proposed policy agenda. Given the strength of the evidence of the health effects of social connection and isolation, there is a need for a robust policy agenda to address this public health issue. I'm going to write down that this is a public health issue, especially over the past 2 years with COVID. This is a public health issue, must address. Okay, we need to have awareness, education, and we need to have national guidelines because the health risks of social isolation and loneliness are currently under-recognized. People do not recognize that they exist. Major health organizations and other stakeholders should explicitly educate and increase awareness among professionals and the public. Indeed, in highlights from a 2020 consensus report, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine call for guidance for health professional schools, training programs, associations, and others for improving awareness of the health impacts of social isolation and loneliness. So we need to make people aware. This awareness and education must be supported by robust or well-developed national guidelines. There are currently national health guidelines around various lifestyle factors. For example, we have nutrition guidelines, we have guidelines for physical activity and sleep that are known. Those things are known to influence health. Nutrition influences your health, physical activity influences your health, and so does sleep. It's time for social connection and isolation to be added to that list. Guidelines about social connection should be evidence-based, subject to periodic revision as new evidence becomes available, and take into consideration the structural, functional, and quality components of social connection. Guidelines may include recommendations of frequency of social activity. For example, most days you should have some sort of social interaction, as well as the type. For example, is it face-to-face interaction or online interaction? Such guidelines can form the basis of federal social policy and programs. Help guide local, state, and national health promotion and disease prevention initiatives, and inform various organizations and industries that develop and market products and services to influence sociality. National health guidelines would support efforts to increase awareness and education in many sectors. For example, guidelines and the evidentiary base for them, the evidence on which they're based, could become part of medical training and K-12 public school health education. So these are things that, you might eventually be studying in health class. Guidelines should facilitate the inclusion of social connection as part of a routine health screening and could form the basis for actionable messages and recommendations that the public may use to guide personal lifestyle changes. So if we focus on the healthcare sector, it says the healthcare sector in particular plays an absolutely critical role in addressing social isolation. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine have recently published several relevant reports that make recommendations to guide policy in this area. For example, in highlights from a 2020 report, the National Academies recommend education and training related to social isolation and loneliness for the healthcare workforce, as well as inclusion of social isolation and loneliness in U.S. Department of Health and Human Services major health strategies. A 2019 report recommends integrating social care into the delivery of health care. A 2017 report identifies social relationships as one of the 5 social risk factors to account for in medical payments. A 2016 report recommends the development of a framework to align the education, health, and other sectors in partnership with communities to educate health professionals in the social determinants of health, the things that determine your health, the social things that determine your health. Finally, a 2015 report recommends assessment of social connection and isolation for inclusion in all electronic health records. So I'm just going to say in the margin, we need to increase awareness, especially healthcare industry. Okay, social in all policies. Although change in the healthcare sector is critical, social isolation can also be addressed through cross-cutting policy change in many other sectors. The World Health Organization, also known as the WHO, we hear about them a lot lately, has a framework of health in all policies. Many stakeholders in the U.S. have adopted similar approaches, which seek to improve the health of all people by incorporating health considerations into decision-making across sectors and policy areas. Although social connection and isolation should be part of these existing approaches, at this time the focus is primarily on other social determinants of health. Thus, a parallel framework of social in all policies could be adopted, recognizing that social well-being is influenced by all sectors of society, including health, transportation, housing, employment, education, food, nutrition, and environment. This framework could guide systematic evaluation of current policy that may facilitate or hinder social connection. Okay, so we need policies to help people. And I'm going to highlight provides examples of current or possible. Okay, Exhibit 1, policies to promote social connection across multiple sectors. For example, transportation that is safe, reliable, and affordable is key to connecting socially and accessing community resources, because we have to have transportation to get to people. Okay? Transportation is key in improving social connections. And accessing resources in community. Okay. Policy focused on transportation can influence the attainment of social goals within other sectors, such as health, education, food and nutrition, and environment, and helps us identify potential barriers and ways to intervene and fix those barriers. Okay, so you can look over the chart. I'm not going to read the chart to you, okay? But these are just ideas. Meals on Wheels, farmers markets bring people together, okay? These are things that are existing or could be possible. Another illustrative or another picture example is in the employment sector's research, and a recent survey suggests that the workplace may contribute significantly to loneliness and social isolation. Most adults spend more waking hours working than any other activity. Thus, the type of work environment, for example, remote only, in-person only, and occasional telecommuting, and the extent to which relevant policies, for example, flexibility in hours and leave, hinder or stop or make difficult or facilitate, make better, improve social connection can potentially influence health outcomes. So, for example, if you are working all remote and at home all the time, you are less socially connected. And that needs to be taken into consideration. So now some evidence for interventions. Although there have been some promising interventions to improve social connectedness and health, a 2020 National Academies of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine Consensus Committee report concluded that the overall quality of evidence for specific clinical and public health interventions for social isolation and loneliness is mixed. So this talks about the quality of evidence mixed. Another recent review reached a similar conclusion, so we might not have all the information we need. Furthermore, among interventions that decrease social isolation or loneliness, not all subsequently reduce health risk. Okay? Among interventions, read it again, among interventions that decrease social isolation or loneliness, it doesn't necessarily mean that it improves health. Okay? So, increase in social connectivity does not necessarily equal, that's the symbol for does not equal improvements in health. Okay. And we're right here. For example, the Enhancing Recovery in Coronary Heart Disease Patients randomized clinical trial sought to reduce depression and low perceived social support as a means of reducing mortality or death rates and recurrent myocardial infarction, which is a problem with your heart, for lack of a better way of saying it. Using a cognitive behavioral therapy-based intervention among admitted patients with acute heart problems, okay, I'm just going to say heart problems. The intervention significantly reduced social isolation, but it didn't have any effect on the cardiovascular outcomes. Indeed, many interventions only assess loneliness or social participation, and they don't really examine whether the intervention results in health-related outcomes positively or negatively. Okay, so there's not always a connection. It is also critical that interventions avoid unintended negative consequences. For example, interventions may create dependencies, people being dependent on things that they can't sustain or can't keep doing, can't keep up with, such as when the friendly visitor who is part of the intervention stops visiting. They can't keep visiting you 3 times a week forever. So when that stops, well, it will stop because people can't sustain that devotion to time. Interventions that increase social contact without regard to the quality of that contact may also potentially increase social conflict and even abuse. Thus, to increase the success of interventions, we must systematically evaluate. We must evaluate what works best for whom and in what context and when. And that's a tall order, gang. The previously noted 2020 National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report indicates that the following evaluation components are necessary to develop a more robust evidence base for interventions: a theoretical framework that drives the approach, appropriate choice of measure, specific target population, scalability or how you measure it, sustainability, how you keep up with it, and data sharing. To date, few interventions to improve health by improving social connectedness have met all these criteria. So I'm not highlighting a whole lot anymore. You notice I'm writing in the margin. So as far as interventions, they don't always help. Your health. And we need more info. Especially, we need a wider range of info. And that part right there is what led me to that note. Ongoing challenges. Despite robust evidence of the health impacts of social connection and isolation, there are several challenges that must be addressed in identifying effective interventions. Measurement. There's an ongoing need for the development of a simple but accurate way of measuring. You don't need those words. Evidence points to the need for a measurement approach that has many, many factors, but currently we are limited to single components like loneliness or social isolation. So we need to develop more factors to calculate a risk score that takes into account structural and functional dimensions of and quality of social relationships. I'm sorry, I need to get back. The development of a multifactorial risk score that takes into account both structural and functional dimensions of and quality of social relationships is needed to adequately assess risk. Okay, so we need more factors to calculate risk scores. We need to develop more factors to assess. Understanding social and digital connection. During the past decade, personal technology, including smartphones and social media, has significantly influenced the way people socialize, with the potential for both harms and benefits. The number of available tools and resources is rapidly expanding. But the technology is outpacing the research on its impacts. The public and private sectors must continually monitor and evaluate emerging technologies to maximize the efficiency and efficacy of their efforts, the efficiency and the extent to which they are effective. As with other public goods and services, if evidence emerges of established harms associated with digital tools and environments, policy and regulations must be put in place to safeguard public health and safety. Similarly, if the evidence establishes clear strengths, then policy must be put in place to ensure including everybody and minimizing the fact that some people don't have access and some people do. It's not an even playing field. Okay? I'm just going to say that technology is or must be a factor. And understudied populations must be adequately represented in research, as well as in potential solutions for social isolation and loneliness. I'm sorry, I lost my place. As well as in potential solutions for social isolation and loneliness and their health sequelae. We got to look that word up, don't we? This is exactly what we would do in class. Secondary effects. We currently have less evidence on the health effects of social isolation and loneliness on underserved and at-risk populations like low income, LGBTQ, and minority race and ethnicity populations, those who face unique barriers to health and healthcare, and so on. Further inclusion is also needed when testing the effectiveness of interventions. Although critics may argue that prioritizing social isolation as a health issue will divert limited resources from other pressing issues. So they're saying there that if we have yet one more health issue, it's going to take resources that are already limited for other issues. It's going to take things away from other issues. And the resources are already limited. For example, your resources for addiction are already limited, resources for violence and poverty. Addressing social isolation and loneliness may also help us address these and other concerns. So, people might argue that, increasing the priority of isolation. Take limited resources from other, kind of pretty needy areas of concern. Okay, and the responses, it really might help. The answer is no. Addressing isolation, I'm just going to put ISO, may help. Other areas of concern. Okay. And there you have some comments, which, you really do not need. Okay. Take care. That is all for now. I'll see you in class.